Great to be back here. I'm excited. It's hard to follow up that butt dialogue. And actually, one of the things that's interesting is that dance is actually a courtship ritual. So if we look at patterns of dance, so you should be there, and I'll, of course, be observing you all. And people all over the world, they dance, right? In every corner, people, they move to music. They follow a rhythm. It's a biorhythm. You dance. It's one and another. They go back and forth. We know that sea dragons off the coast of Australia, the pipefish, like seahorses, weedy sea dragons, they dance into the night, a mirror dance. One follows the other for hours. And they have to do that in order for the female to drop her eggs, the male to fertilize the eggs. And then actually in many species of seahorse, for instance, the male will actually carry the eggs. The male is the one that gives birth. So dance is important across the animal kingdom, including for humans. Oh, there's so much more to say, but I have a limited time. So it's great to be back with you all tonight. I can't believe this is one of our final evening, and I'm going to dive right in. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about technology, sexuality, and intimacy. For this weekend so far, we've thought a lot about what is intimacy and how do we explore it in our own lives. And I want to get back to some themes I brought up. I like that I've gotten to be the bookends, that I can sort of bring some things up in the beginning and then again at the end. And what we've really explored over this weekend about thinking about intimacy in the current context, right? In the current environment of how we engage with technology, with each other. It's a different game. For me, as an evolutionary biologist, I often think about the evolved social behavior, how we compare to those birds in Papua New Guinea who do a dance as part of a courtship ritual. Many of you have seen the David Attenborough videos with the birds, and the humans do something remarkably similar. And I tell my college students this, and they go, "No, we don't." And then, of course, the guys all say, "No, we don't." And the women all go, "Yes, they do." Right? And it's because humans, much like many other birds, it's often males that do what's called lekking. They do the performance. They do the dance. And females then choose, in general, in the heterosexual context. Anyway, I'm going to get off on a tangent. Sorry. So let's talk about sexual. I could talk about birds for hours. They're remarkable. They're also the reverse of mammals. In birds, 90% of species are monogamous, or socially monogamous. In mammals, it's only 3% that are socially monogamous. Primates, 15%. So we're somewhat unique in that pattern of social monogamy, of that intense bonding. It's somewhat more common in birds, but in part that's because in birds, the gametes are switched. So in humans, it's males that are heterogametic, right? That we have females are XX, they're homogametic, males are heterogametic. It's swapped in birds. And many biologists and geneticists think that lays the underground of why that pattern might be different taxonomically. Anyway, I'm going to get back to technology. Sorry. Birds are so cool. Anyway. So when we think about technology in our lives, we can think about all the ways that we can use it. We can capitalize on it. Right? We often think of it as a problem, as something that, how do you make sense of this? How do you use your cell phone in your romantic relationship? Should you be texting? Should you be sexting? Should you be calling each other? But there's also ways that it amplifies our relationships unlike ever before, right? We can connect to each other. So we can send each other those relationships. So I was in a long-distance relationship for quite a while. We would text each other every morning. Whoever was up first would say good morning, right? And how do you have those rituals, those behaviors, right? When you don't have that connection, right? When you're not necessarily physically, you're not just rolling over and you know who's awake first. And how can we integrate it into our lives? And those rituals become quite important. We can also do things. I almost put a picture of Amanda and I were doing a virtual reality thing, but I didn't because I looked like I was about to vomit because I was. So I thought I shouldn't put a picture where you can see me green. But you can think, right, we have this potential to use technology in our romantic lives like never before. It's changing how we understand sexual function, how we understand particular arousal patterns, how we can connect to each other, particularly if you travel for work, if you're long distance. But with that also comes some complications. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about. And of course, I was talking to my niece the other night on FaceTime, and I realized, so she was telling me about the college semester just ended, and her new boyfriend, they're going to be away from each other for the summer, and she was telling me the story, and I realized she had never known a way of interacting with someone where FaceTime and Skype wasn't an option. Video conferencing was something that we're using at work now, right? But she never had the option of understanding it. So we can think about how we connect, right, in ways that we never really have before. This is really remarkable. But of course, as we think about that across generations, how we integrate that technology, we come up with a very obvious question. Is it the same? Is it the same if you look at someone on a camera as opposed to holding them and feeling them and smelling them? And as a biologist, no. Bottom line is no. But I want to talk through some of that over the next half hour with you and sort of what we understand of how people are integrating these technologies into their lives. Well, when it comes to our romantic lives, in some sense, I swear I'm not on the payroll of all these companies. So if you think about these, right, these companies or these tools out there, you can be long distance, you can integrate technology, you can send your partner a gift, you can look up what they might like, you can send them a bouquet of flowers, you can have a card delivered if you're not physically there. Even if you are physically there and you're at work for 10 hours, or you're on a deadline, or if you're in tax season, or if you're on a grant deadline, like I often have, right? You can stay connected. We can utilize technology in our intimate lives. We often think of it as a barrier, as that problem out there, that we're not connecting the same way that we used to in past generations, and that's absolutely true. But how do we think about this as stuff that we can integrate, that we can use? The room shaking, right? I'm not, okay. Yeah? Am I having a stroke or is the room shaking? No? Okay. Either are possible. So I only had one glass of wine. I swear Claudia could vouch for me. So we can think about, right? We can think about that. Sorry, I had another joke about acid, but it was going to take us too far over. So we can think about, right, that we can use this stuff. I mean, imagine, how many people here have sent an e-card to their partner? Right? How many of you sent it not for a holiday, just to send it? That's not that many, right? That's not that many. Why not? How hard is it? 3 clicks, maybe 2 minutes. You could do it while you're sitting on the toilet, for Christ's sake, right? But we can integrate this stuff into our lives. So rather than necessarily think of them as barriers, we can think about them as ways to amplify our relationships and the way we connect. So at the same time that we're less connected physically than ever before, we're more connected than ever before. And that duality is something that I really want us to think about, of not how we can change in our lives. We think of that as a problem, to harness it, to amplify. Imagine that if you got an e-card from your partner right now, if you walked out of the room and just got a card that said, I love you, or I miss you, or can't wait to your home, how would that make you feel? Right? Most people would say good. Maybe you'd say, oh, they won't leave me alone, and that's, we need a relationship therapist can talk with you, you got your own problems, right? But probably it amplifies how we feel connected to each other. Okay, so I put this slide up the other night, and for me it's really thinking about, as a biological organism, what are those sort of senses? How are we engaging with the environment? How do we engage with each other? And part of the challenge, I think, as much as I want to be hopeful and talk about how we use technology, part of the challenge is how we integrate these bodily senses. That with technology, that if you're just texting your partner good morning, if you're communicating long distance, if you are having your most important conversations over text as opposed to face-to-face, the research says you shouldn't do that, by the way. If it's conflict, you should do it on the phone or in person. The data's quite clear. Texting is not a good idea. Some of you are nodding like, yeah, stop sending me that. If it's simple stuff, it's fine. Actually, I work with a colleague, our financial officer. Her husband has the same last name as me, so every so often I get a message that's like a directive. But it's not like anything bad. It's like, like you pick up the milk. And and it's funny because so she's like, are you weighing in on how I communicate with my husband? I was like, of course I am. Right? So, right, we can use technology in that sense. But let's not forget about, it's still different, right? It's still different. You're not feeling each other, hearing each other, smelling each other, tasting each other. And that's not just for a relationship, that's for the courtship process, right? So how many of you have ever smelled someone you attracted to someone and you miss them and you smell their scarf or you smell their shirt, right? Or there's that certain cologne they use, that certain perfume they wear. And the reverse can happen too. Sometimes you could smell someone and go, ugh, Christ, like wash everything in my house, right? They have to go. And that can also change for different things. It could change based on biological systems. So for instance, women who are on hormonal birth control, the MHC, the major histocompatibility complex that's involved in pheromone detection, it switches. Because if you're on hormonal birth control, you go into a state of biological pregnancy, right? It's sort of how the body is responding to hormones. So there's been anecdotes of women saying, my partner and I, heterosexual women, my partner and I, we want to have a baby, so I stopped taking hormonal birth control, and then, I can't stand the smell of him. But now I've got to try and make a baby with him. So, and I don't have to tell you how you do that. And so, you could go to a lab anyway, sorry. So these senses are involved, and we can manipulate them in all sorts of ways, for better or worse, right? And they do get manipulated, sometimes unexpectedly. But when we don't invoke them, it's a different game. This is a game that our species has played for millions of years, for millennia, right? We are connected to the rest of the biological world. We are connected in that we have systems that have evolved in order to detect those around us. Who are our social kin? Who are our romantic and sexual partners? Who should we breed with? Who should we not? Who should we socialize with? Who should we not? Who's a threat? Who's an ally? Right? We are just like every other social species on that. Those of you that have dogs and cats, you know this stuff, right? Maybe even fish, you know this stuff, right? I have sea monkeys, and I've tried to train them, and they're not so cooperative, right? Because they're not vertebrates, right? So I actually do have sea monkeys. It's not a lie. So leave it to it's an ecosphere. And long story. Okay. So what we can think about though is that those systems do get invoked, right? We can think of things like body language. We know that there's all sorts of stuff about how you stand, how you communicate, right? How we gesture and posture and the type of eye contact we make, the types of facial expressions we make. I, for instance, am someone who I don't really hide. Amanda can tell you, my colleague Amanda Gussman, I don't really hide my emotional expressions all that well, which is fine in terms of being a social person. It's a little bit complicated when I have my administrative hat on at work, right? Because every so often something will happen and they're like, he doesn't like it. And I was like, no, what are you talking about? We'll figure this out. It's like, no, he really doesn't like it. But of course we know how to do this. These are evolved patterns, right? So just as much as we think about how we utilize technology for our verbals of how we communicate, we also take seriously all the sorts of nonverbals, right? Human communication, like communication in every other social species, involves all sorts of patterns, some of which are saying, I love you, and some of which is doing, I love you, right? It's not just telling the persons, but how you do it. Now, in a technological era, right? How do we can think about how we use technology to communicate, but then how do we also do all the nonverbal stuff? How do you show it in a technological era, not just say it? You could text someone, I miss you, but how do you demonstrate? What becomes the behavioral process of showing, not just saying? Emoji, yeah, I gotta get there. Yes, you're right, it is issue, but not more than 3, because then you're weird, right? So, okay. So, for instance, some of you this morning did the eye-gazing task. I was going to have you do it, and I decided not. But if you stare someone in the eye, right? I think some of you did it in the class this morning, and many of you who here has done this, right? Where you stare someone in the eye for 30 seconds? Okay, so enough of you have done it. It's uncomfortable. Usually about 30 seconds in, you start to giggle, and you start to squirm, right? And I do this in one of my large lectures in my relationship class, and usually about 45 seconds in, like every so often someone cries. People usually start laughing, right? Because it's because as a primate, we don't really do direct eye gazing that often, other than if it's a real intimate, comfortable other. Because, I'm a New Yorker, I don't want to look anyone in the eye, but we know that if you do that eye gazing, that it can be a sign of aggression, it can be a sign of, but it depends on the context. You could lay in bed with a partner and maybe look in each other's eyes for minutes, for an hour, for hours. But it's a different context, right? As opposed to the social unknown. And in fact, there's all sorts of nonverbals that go on in that, right? So you might not notice, but depending on how you looked at the partner or how the person looked at you, maybe you can find something that you didn't know about someone here as they were looking at you. But the way we do it can be different, the way the eyes move across the face. In part because what this is it's looking at different parts of the face. Different parts of affective response. So if you're looking at affective response above here, it's in one of the things that I think is interesting about the sort of rise of Botox is that you actually remove affect from parts of the face, but part of that affect is something we've evolved over millions of years to use, to do, to engage with. How you respond, right? That lack of affect can communicate very different nonverbal information. We don't think about that. You might say, well, the nonverbal information is that I look 10 years younger. But, right, it could be that there's all sorts of other times of affective communication. So how do we think about that? What are other ways we do it? You might socially touch someone as you're talking to them. Well, even that's changing, right? We're at a time that we're starting to think about how do you touch, how do you consent? We're increasingly telling children in kindergarten, if you don't want to hug, you don't have to hug. Someone has to ask you if they want to hug. I think that's a good thing. I think that's an important thing. But what it means is that humans have all sorts of nonverbal behaviors of how we look, of how we feel, of how we interact that are part of our evolutionary history. It's part of what it means to be a social animal. And we can get a lot of information out of it, and sometimes it makes us uncomfortable. It's why that eye-gazing activity makes you uncomfortable, because there's some level of dominance, there's some level of understanding, it's vulnerability, and that's staring into someone. It's why you can do it with someone you're in bed with, but maybe not a stranger on the street, or someone in the subway, right? So those of you who are, where's my other New Yorker? Where's my Manhattan buddy? There you are. So if we sat on the subway and stared at someone for 30 seconds, good luck, right? I do not recommend that, period. End of statement, right? So we know that, that these things can have different contextual meaning, right? Okay, so in this technological era, what are we doing with how we think about communicating with each other? Is love and sex still important? Or have we shifted to thinking about other things, right? Is it more about social activity, right? In this sort of cell phone era, is all this stuff that science has spent decades trying to understand how we communicate and why we communicate and what we're communicating when we don't realize, is it still important? Is love and sex, like many of us in this room, that we think it's quite important, is it really true? Well, that becomes a question. It's an empirical question. And if we look at the data, it's a little bit of a troubling one. So here's a study from a Harris Institute poll. Adult Americans were asked about different things that they find important. What could they not live without? And many people said food. You know, I am fundamentally a biologist. I would say that food is something that you can't live without. Although I have a friend who's on the Soylent kick now, so who knows. Right, so some people would say a car, right? And what makes sense, maybe in terms of getting to work, in terms of socializing. But look at where sex is, right? And look at where love is. It's down there, and so low on the graph you don't even see it, right? So, of course, the punchline for the Harris poll was that mobile phone use rated higher than sex on average, right? So if we want to talk about radiant intimacy, what are we building our intimate connections with? Are we using the phone as a device to connect? Or are we using the phone as the object of the connection, right? And that's a very different thing. If we think about psychologically how we communicate, how we do verbals, how we do nonverbals, the information that we exchange. When we think about our technology, the question is, do we use it as a tool to socially connect, or does it become the social connection? And I think that question is one of the most profound ones for scientists like Amanda and I to really understand about how humans are connecting today. And I'm afraid I don't have a good answer. We don't know. But I do know that some of the data is starting to tell us that it's quite varied. And there are some people who are using the actual tools as their connection. It's not being used as a way to kind of bridge with others, but it becomes the object. Right? So you've all seen the meme, the photos. If you're laying in bed and you're looking at the two people laying in bed, each looking at their phone, right? What becomes the level of connection, right? Okay, but in many ways also technology has become useful to us, right? Today you could go online and you could find a partner. If you really want someone who has the same music taste as you, you don't have to worry about who's just in your tribe. You could turn to the internet and look at people who are in your local, who's on your block, who's in your business, who's in your city, who's in your state, right? And in fact, if we look at how people are using the internet to connect, half of single Americans today have used an online dating platform or app. That's 1 in 5 of people. 1 in 2 people, sorry. I'm supposed to be good at statistics, right? 1 in 2 people. I was thinking 50% and they blended in my mind, sorry. So 1 in 2 single adults have used technology to connect with another person. Those numbers are even higher among gay men and lesbian women, probably because it's safer in most of America, right? We often forget that there's still a lot of places that various ways of being and connecting are not acceptable, right? We know that 40% of singles have dated someone they met online. Now, I put these numbers up as comparison. Only a quarter have met through a friend and 6% at a bar. That is so different, right? As a species, if we look cross-culturally, Usually your partnerships happen because of who you're connected with, who you're set up with, maybe even arranged. And we see something very different today. We're seeing that people are doing it themselves and they're utilizing technology. And in fact, it's not only part of the way we connect, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So if we look at what singles spend on dating in a year, Helen and Fisher and I calculated roughly $82 billion in the US economy goes towards dating. Part of that is online dating platforms, right? This is not just something that we're doing in passing. This is something that's quite serious. Of course it is. It's courtship. It's how we connect. It's one of the fundamental relationships of our existence. Right? Now, these technologies have all sorts of different platforms. They use different algorithms. The science is so-so, right? We don't really know. There isn't a good answer. When someone says to you, what's the perfect algorithm? How do you connect to another person? The best algorithm's up here. The best algorithm is the evolved human brain. We've been doing it for millions of years. The statistical ones tend to explain less than 10% of the variance, so they're not that effective. Right? And as I told you the other night, we see at 1.8 billion swipes in a day. It's an enormous amount of data, but a matching rate of less than 1.44% on one unnamed platform. Right? So they're not particularly effective. Bottom line is it's not that effective. So although we're using technology at greater rates than ever before to try and connect, we're also struggling with technology at greater rates than ever before. And of course, there's all sorts of different kinds. There's Grindr, which is for men who have sex with men. It's more of a hookup app. Some people have suggested Tinder is like a hookup app. What's interesting is when Grindr came out, there was an app that came out at the same time called Blender. Does anyone remember it? It was a little bit popular in the Bay Area. But it was a heterosexual form of Grindr. It was a hookup app, but it didn't launch. It just didn't work. Heterosexual women weren't signing up. But 5 years later, all of a sudden Tinder launched with a very similar platform. One of my colleagues, who's a very famous gender scholar, who I'll leave unnamed, said, well, you know it's because gays make culture. And I'll just let him say it, not me. So, right, and of course there's all sorts of other apps and platforms that have then become popular. So here's one, for instance, for people who are looking for more than two people in their relationship. So technology has also allowed us to think about the diversity of human romantic and sexual lives and experiences and desires and needs, and finding ways to connect with each other, right? We know that there are popular platforms like Match, who I work with, there's plenty of others, that are influencing how people connect. And we don't know all that much about what works well and what doesn't work that well. There are some things we know. Okay, here's the moment that I know some of you want advice. Okay, ready? Everyone, you have your pen? 3 sentences in your message. 3 sentences. One of them has to be a question. Okay, this is real. This is based on big data, based on millions of responses. No more than 3 sentences in a message. If you're exchanging with someone on a dating site, 1 should be a question. The question should be based on their profile. All right? You should have pictures of yourself. And of course, the most important thing, which we found in a paper we recently published that was covered widely in the media, is put a puppy in your picture. Oh, God. Do you want to get your numbers up? Cuddle that little puppy. Where's the puppy? Where are my friends with the puppy? Where are you? Here you are. Yeah, right? We should have set you guys up with a shop, right? So there are certain patterns, right? There are certain patterns of human behavior. Why does someone with a picture of a puppy get more images? Side note, if you have an exotic bird, it doesn't work. No, it's based on data, not personal experience. So, right? But we know that partly you're showing your ability to caretake, your ability to engage, right? Your ability to, if you have a baby, it might raise a question of, is it yours? So which is fine, but then you skew the population, right? If you're a single parent, that's fine. But then we know that it's harder for single parents to date, right? So, but showing that you're engaged, that you're responsible. So, okay, think about that for a moment, right? So we think about this online dating platform as this sort of big, complex game of swiping. But what do you know? We're engaging the same human brain in the same fundamental patterns of social behavior. Can you socialize? Can you be responsible? Can you caretake? Same patterns, right? Same evolved brain, just in a new technological era. And we know that it's also happening for older generations. The fastest growing online dating platform in America for the last few years has been Our Time for people ages 50 and older. And I think, I don't know if I said this yesterday, one of the interesting patterns of transgenerational is that younger people are putting their parents and their grandparents on dating platforms, right? Usually we think of transgenerational information happening top down. We're seeing that it's happening bottom up. Younger people are influencing dating. And one of the great findings we had from some papers with our colleague Peter Gray and Amanda and I is that compared to when they were younger, most people who are over the age of 50 say that they have a deeper appreciation for relationships now. They're better partners, they're pickier about who they date, and they say it's easier to figure out if the person is right for them. And they also say they're better at sex, at least 1 in 3 do. So bottom line, go date in an old age home. No, so what it does suggest is that we should be talking across generations about dating, right? You millennials, you're struggling with dating, talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents. If you have millennials at home that are talking about dating, have a frank conversation with them. Be honest with them, right? That we have to be talking more about love and sex and intimacy and relationships across generations, across experiences. What do you know that makes you say that you're better now than you were 40 years ago? Share that information. We're a social species. We have to share what we know and what we don't. So when we think about this, as I said earlier, we're more connected than ever before. You can email someone, you could text them, but is it really quality connection, right? So we can think about, you could send someone a message like, I love you. I was in graduate school, actually, and studying relationships, and I had a partner send me that, say, I love you. And then when we broke up, she said, well, I didn't say I love you. I said love, L-U-V. I thought it was fascinating, right? Actually, she sent me a message not long ago. I haven't forgotten that, so I don't reply. Right? Or you could send a little heart. Yeah. I mean, I'm flattered they come back to roost. But right? But how we connect, the kind of messages that we're sending, the meaning in that message, the fact that people will say this is different from saying I love you, right? What a linguistic trick, right? Oh, sorry, the 22-year-old graduate student's coming back. I'm gonna get really crazy now. And it was so right, we could think about how we're connecting and why we're connecting, and the types of messages we're exchanging there. I already told you about this, so I'll go quick, but we talked about sexting, for instance. In the study that Amanda and I did, we found that 1 in 5 people report sexting, sending or receiving, but what was interesting is that we found that they were doing it to flirt often with an existing partner. We often have this crisis that young people are sexting, but it's often being done to connect to an existing partner. And of course, here's the sharing rate. So we asked people, have you ever shared a sext message? 19% of women, 23% of men said yes, and on average, they do it with more than 3 partners. So there is a risk, but the risk is the non-consensual distribution, right? And part of that risk builds the vulnerability that can both make a relationship more exciting and more troubling. And we also found, of course, as you all know, that communicating affect, I've given my own punchlines away, right? So that we know that things like emoji use, it's associated with personality factors that are actually quite useful for relationships, things like agreeableness and emotional stability. It's associated with higher emotional intelligence, probably because if you want to communicate affect, you sort of have this platform, and how do you do it? And sort of things like emojis and emoticons, you recognize that you have to communicate in some ways in this digital platform, and attachment styles, they're less likely to be avoidant. And of course, if you just want the bottom line, people who use more emojis go on more dates and have more sex. So there is a sort of measurable outcome there. It's not just that they're perhaps better partners, but it's more effective, right? So we can think of all sorts of other ways that technology is involved, right? As I told you yesterday, 1 in 4 singles say that they would have sex with a robot. As the scientist, I want to know who the other 3/4 are, right? But half of singles would consider it infidelity if their partner had sex with a robot. I think that says something fascinating about our romantic psychology, about our relational psychology. Not because, I'm not a moralist, not because I think it's good or bad. I totally understand this statistic of why people have those mixed reactions. But what is that? Think about that. Think about if you're partnered and your partner's not here, and they said, I hope you're having a great time at that workshop, and I just had sex with a robot, right? How would you feel? Would it be better if they discussed it first? Can it have a name? Right? And in fact, there's a whole market here. We often think about sex as robots as something kind of silly, but if you actually look at what's happening, they're becoming more and more lifelike, right? This is not something that's in the abstract. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that are making robots look more and more human, right? If I were to make that image small, good luck telling me that's not a real live human being, right? And you can swap the eyes, you can change the makeup, you can have them be open eyes or closed eyes, you can change the clothes, right? So when we think about how we're connecting as humans, how is that changing in the current technological era? What does it mean for your intimacy? There are many people who, in fact, maybe this is good for them, right? Maybe that's what they want, but what does it mean for our intimacy? There's also, of course, I think forensic psychologists are having a field day because there's all sorts of questions about what might happen if your sort of main interaction is with an individual that doesn't give back, right? That doesn't connect with you in the way that you might connect with it. Right? Deep psychological questions we can ask. And of course, there's all sorts of things like the rise of what's called teledildonics, some of you might be familiar with. So this is a sex toy app that you can use with your partner, and this is the male side, this is the female side for a heterosexual couple, and you sync it over like something like Skype or a sort of video conferencing, so you could be halfway around the world with your partner and having sex with them. Right? So this is an insertive part of the device for females, and there's the receptive part of the device for males. I'm not making this up. I'm not on their payroll. Swear to God, right? You want to talk about technology and sex? It is a brave new world, right? Of how people are trying to interact, how they're trying to make it work, but it also raises all sorts of new complications. I know, now I have to be like, no, look under your seat for a teledildonic. God, Amanda, when I get there, that's when you have to pull the plug. Okay, so, right, we can think about that. So here are some statistics from Pornhub, one of the largest websites used for pornography, right? So we know that in 2017, 28.5 billion annual visits to Pornhub. A lot of you asked me to talk briefly about pornography. 81 million daily average visits, right? This is a massive amount of engagement with pornography, with sex that, now for some people that actually can be useful. I'm always a little bit cautious about what I say about pornography, in part because academics fight to the death over aspects of pornography. But the way that people connect, right, the way that people understand it, I think is quite complicated. Actually, it's a loaded series of questions around pornography. It's much more common among millennials, although older populations spend about a minute longer watching pornography. I could say, I'll let that one hang. Right? But when we think about pornography consumption, right? What is the context of what people are watching? And what we know is some great work by folks like Jolly is that the content has become more aggressive, it's become more sexist, it's become more demeaning towards women, right? There's more things about violence, increased rates of non-condom use, there's more scripts about rape scenes in pornography. So while for some people, and even for some couples, it could become a context of sort of being aroused. I mean, there's couples could watch pornography, it might be quite good for their relationship. We also know that there's a larger context, that the content is becoming more problematic and more troublesome, right? And what does that mean for people's romantic and sexual expectations, what we often call pornographic literalism? You know, I'm a biologist. I've studied people's sexual lives all around the world. I've looked at people's patterns of sexual activity in 144 societies. The notion that your sex life is someone going, oh, man, oh, Johnny, right? For millions of years, people had sex with children 3 feet away from them, right? You don't necessarily bang the walls in states of ecstasy. It's not to say it's bad. It's not to say that sex isn't a performance, but the notion that that's a natural biological response just doesn't hold up to the evidence, right? It doesn't hold up to the cross-cultural evidence. It's not to say that that performative aspect of sex can't be wonderful and entertaining and exciting, but it's a performance, right? But what's happening there with people? Do you come to expect that performance every time? Do you come to expect that show every time? I had a young woman say to me once, why do men always want to know if you orgasm? Right? The funny part of the story is I was on a date. But it's a true story. Amanda can verify. We know, right, that there's this concern about how that performance is stacking up. The question isn't, did you enjoy it? Were you comfortable? Was it good? But was it, you didn't scream. You didn't pull the blinds off the window. Is that okay for you? Right? I think that's a very different way of how we understand what things like pleasure and satisfaction mean. We also know there's questions about things like how pornography gets integrated into our romantic and sexual lives. And there's all sorts of debates about whether or not it's associated with increased rates of sexual dysfunction, particularly among men. There seems to be a little bit of an effect there. But then there are huge debates about sex addiction. A lot of sexologists actually don't even use the term sex addiction because they argue that it doesn't meet the criteria of a true addiction neurobiologically. It's a whole kettle of fish that I'm going to just sort of sidestep. But there's all sorts of debates about sort of what's going on as pornography. Could it be good for some people? Overall, could it be? Because you get used to the stimuli, right? You get used to the same stimuli, and then do you come to expect that in your own sexual lives? And of course, in a recent meta-analysis by my colleague Paul Wright, they found that on average, pornography consumption was associated with sexual aggression among both men and women. And they said, quote, violent content may be exacerbating effect because so much pornography does include violent content, right? So we also can talk about things what we call, what Peggy Orenstein calls the pornification of everyday American life, right? And also Nancy Jo Salz in her work. Now, one way I like to think about this, I put my biology hat on, is that the body responds to the environment, right? We know that our body responds to how we connect, has implications for love and sex. Now, if the body perceives a state of threat, right? We know that. We know, we've been talking about that this weekend. If the body perceives a state of threat, that is not conducive for intimacy. It is not conducive for close relationships. You wouldn't be next to someone that you felt threatened with and said, let's be best friends, right? You sort of intuitively know that's deranged, right? You wouldn't do that. But what happens then when we think about the over-sexualization of our lives? And in particular, the way we can think about that is a framework that we call neuroception. My colleague Steve Porges and the work of Jaak Panksepp, which some of you probably know, on the sort of emotions, on affect, right? It's that the body is constantly responding to the environment. So neuroception is that a neural process distinct from perception that is capable of distinguishing environmental features that are safe, dangerous, and life-threatening. The way you can think about that is that we have these responses of flight or fight or freeze, right? That we respond to the environment. What is that? If you have that anxiety response or you have that freeze response, you're responding to environmental cues. It's a neurobiological response. So what happens when we have this pornification? This is what my colleague Leslie Haywood and I have argued. What happens when you have this pornification, when particularly women and particularly young women are constantly sexualized? Right? If we have all this pressure to engage in sex, do we view it as something that's fun or do we view it as something as a threat? And there's the question of how we view it up here cognitively, but then there's the question of how the body views it. How does the body respond to the environment? If you believe that you're in a state of threat, of objectification, of being watched, of being told what to do, of expectations, that is not a body that is prepared for intimacy, for closeness, for love, for help, for healing. That is a body that is in a state of threat. And a state of threat is not one that can do all the stuff we've talked about doing this weekend. Okay? So when we think about this use of technology, here's my take-home message. I don't think it's doomsday. I think the question is, how do we take control of it? How do we own it in our lives? How do we use it the way that we want to use it? To send your partner that intimate message, to send off the e-card, to stay connected, right? So that you know that your friends are posting pictures that you haven't seen in 3 years. That gives you the ability to say, that cheesecake looks delicious. Why don't we make it together next weekend at my house? Right? Use that technology as a way to connect, not just to watch, not to just be a voyeur of the social world, to be engaged in the social world. Right? That's what the human animal does. So that just as technology is something that's dividing us, that's making it more complex to connect, let's own it. Let's make it something that we can use together to build those forms of bonds, to engage the evolved animal within, right? It becomes a tool for growth, not a tool of loss. Thank you.